Emily, don't go to the cafe today. It's dangerous, my mother whispered into the phone. At the same moment, a homeless man grabbed my wrist. If you open that door first, he said quietly, you will die. I looked at the cafe door. The brass handle. The glass reflecting my pale face. The thin line beneath the threshold I had never noticed before. My heart stopped. For 1 second, I stood between life and something I did not yet understand. And then I turned around and walked away. I'm glad you're here right now. Subscribe and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, it truly matters to me. Because if I hadn't turned around that day, this story would have ended very differently. That day looked as if the world was incapable of surprises. I woke up exactly at 5, not because of the alarm, but because the habit had settled deep into my bones. In our kitchen, the refrigerator hummed softly, and the old radiator clicked now and then, as if counting minutes instead of me. I lay still for a few seconds, listening toward my mother's room. Her breathing was uneven, but it was there. That was the only signal that mattered. I got up, wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself, and, without turning on the bright light, placed a small pot on the stove. When I poured the oats in, they rustled dry and ordinary, like paper in an office. While the porridge thickened, I laid out her medication on the table, 1 white pill, 1 blue capsule, half of a yellow tablet, split carefully and evenly. I placed a glass of water beside them and folded a napkin in half because she liked things neat, even now. In her room, it was dim. She was already awake, staring at the ceiling as if it might explain why life sometimes takes your legs but leaves you with all your thoughts. Morning already, she whispered. Yes, Mama. Eat while it's warm, I said, helping her sit up. Her hands were light but stubborn. She hated when I could see how difficult things had become. While she ate, I glanced at the calendar with the medication marks. The pharmacy receipt lay nearby, sharply folded in half, like an accusation. I knew the amount by heart. I knew it as clearly as my own phone number. And still, every time I saw it, something tightened beneath my ribs. I kissed her forehead, left the remote and phone within reach, checked the wheelchair brakes the way I always did. I'll be back at 3, I said. Watch your step, she replied. She always said that. And I always nodded, even though what I truly needed was to watch more than just my step. I put on my old brown jacket, the one that should have been thrown away long ago but still held warmth, and stepped outside. The air smelled of damp pavement. On the corner, the bakery had just opened, and the scent of yeast and fresh bread drifted down the street like a small, temporary hope. A delivery truck rattled somewhere nearby. Someone smoked nervously at the bus stop. Someone else hurried a child toward school. The city lived its life without noticing mine. The road to the cafe was familiar in detail, the cracked tile near the crossing, the yellow street lamp that flickered even in daylight, the bench where a stray cat sometimes slept. I walked quickly. Being late was not an option. Not with Mark. Inside, the cafe wrapped around me with the thick smell of coffee, warm and heavy, almost comforting. But comfort did not reach far enough. I saw Mark near the register, counting money with the same precision he would later use to count other people's mistakes. You're 2 minutes late, he said without lifting his eyes. I'm sorry, I answered automatically. I had learned to apologize so often that the word had lost weight. Lena stood behind the counter laughing at something on her phone. She barely looked at me. She was younger. She still believed life could be rearranged with a wish. I knew better. Life rearranged itself around bills. The rush began. Cups clinked. Milk hissed. The grinder rattled sharply. I moved in circles, grind, tamp, pour, wipe, smile, absorb small complaints as if they were justified. When someone said the coffee tasted weak, I apologized, though what truly felt thin was my strength. One thought kept repeating in my mind, the medication. I calculated between orders. If I took extra shifts. If I saved a little more on groceries. If I postponed buying new shoes again? I was not thinking about danger. I was thinking about the price of survival and small cardboard boxes of pills. Around noon, I stepped outside for a minute of air. The sun was pale, colorless. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes, allowing myself one small pause. And at that moment, I still had no idea that within a few hours, I could be dead. When I walked back toward the cafe door, the air felt heavier. Nothing obvious had changed. The street looked the same, a delivery truck idled near the corner, sunlight reflected off parked cars, someone across the road argued softly into their phone. Through the glass I could see Lena stacking cups, her movements slow and careless. A customer by the window leaned over his laptop, unaware of anything beyond his screen. It was all ordinary. And yet, something inside me tightened. I had reached that door thousands of times. My hand knew the distance without thinking. My body moved toward it automatically. But just before my fingers touched the brass handle, my eyes dropped. The metal strip beneath the threshold was slightly raised. Not broken. Not shattered. Just wrong. A thin shadow cut across the lower edge. At first I thought it was dirt. Or a scratch. Or a trick of light. I leaned a little closer. It was not a shadow. It was a wire. So fine that it could disappear if you blinked too quickly. It slipped out from beneath the metal strip and disappeared into the frame of the door, vanishing into a small crack that had never caught my attention before. My mind refused to process it. I stared at it blankly, as if I were looking at something abstract. Something meaningless. The espresso machine inside hissed sharply. A cup clinked against a saucer. Someone laughed. Everything continued. But my breathing changed. It became shallow, tight. I crouched slightly, pretending to adjust my shoe, so I could look closer without drawing attention. My fingertips brushed the laces, but my eyes never left that thin, deliberate line. It was not loose construction material. It was placed there. Carefully. Intentionally. A cold wave began at the base of my spine and moved upward, spreading slowly through my chest. My hand started trembling before I understood why. I straightened up. The door handle was inches away. If I opened it. If I pulled it toward me like I had every other day. The thought fractured before finishing itself. That was when Jack stepped beside me. I hadn't heard him approach. He moved quietly, always had. His boots made almost no sound against the pavement. He did not look at the door first. He looked at me. There was something in his expression I had never seen before, not pity, not hunger, not simple gratitude. Recognition. He followed my gaze downward. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Don't," he said. Just one word. Soft. Controlled. I swallowed. "What is that?" I asked, though my voice sounded distant, as if it belonged to someone else. He did not answer immediately. His eyes traced the wire to the frame, then up toward the hinges. "Step back," he said. My phone vibrated in my palm. The sound made me flinch. It was my mother. My fingers shook as I answered. "Emily," she whispered, and her voice was strained in a way I had never heard before. "Please don't go inside. I had such a terrible dream. There was fire. And wires. Wires." The word echoed inside my skull. I looked again. The metal strip. The thin, deliberate line. The door that separated me from the room I needed so desperately to return to. Jack's hand closed around my wrist. His grip was firm but not violent. "If you open that door first," he said quietly, "you will die." There was no drama in his tone. No raised voice. Just certainty. For one long second, I hesitated. My job was inside. My wages were inside. My only steady income. What if this was nothing? What if I was about to ruin everything because of a feeling? Mark already thought I was slow. Replaceable. If I caused a scene, if I refused to go in. But then another thought pushed through the fog. What if this was not nothing? What if that wire was waiting for pressure? Waiting for the shift of weight when the door moved. Waiting for the first person who stepped across the threshold. The first person. Me. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I took one step back. Then another. I forgot something, I called through the glass when Lena glanced at me, irritation already forming on her face. She rolled her eyes dramatically and turned away. Inside, life continued without pause. Outside, mine was balancing on something invisible. Jack released my wrist only when I had put several feet between myself and the door. Go home, he said. But I didn't move immediately. I stared at the entrance. It looked harmless. Unchanged. A simple cafe door with smudged fingerprints and a faded sticker advertising seasonal drinks. No blinking lights. No ticking sound. Just a thin wire beneath a lifted strip of metal. And suddenly, with a clarity so sharp it hurt, I understood something I could not yet explain. It was not random. It was not an accident. It was placed. And it was placed for the first person who opened that door. For the employee who arrived earliest. For the one who unlocked and stepped in without question. For me. I did not run. That is what I remember most clearly. I did not scream. I did not grab Lena by the sleeve and pull her out. I did not pound on the glass and shout warnings. I walked. Slowly. Carefully. As if the ground itself had become unstable. My legs felt hollow, almost foreign, like they no longer belonged to me. Each step required intention. The sounds of the street blurred into a dull hum, engines, distant voices, the faint clatter of dishes from inside the cafe. It all seemed far away, as though I were already removed from the scene of my own life. When I reached the corner, I stopped and pressed my palm against the cold brick wall of the bakery. The rough surface grounded me. I focused on the texture beneath my skin. Breathe in. Breathe out. My phone was still in my hand. I hadn't even realized I was gripping it so tightly until my fingers began to ache. My mother's voice echoed in my mind. Wires. Not be careful. Not come home early. Wires. I looked at my reflection in the darkened phone screen. My face appeared pale, almost translucent. My lips were slightly parted, as if I had forgotten how to close them properly. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to hold the phone with both of them. I could feel my pulse everywhere, in my wrists, in my neck, behind my eyes. And suddenly, without warning, the past months surged forward all at once. Looking at my phone, I suddenly remembered how it all began. The accident had happened on a completely ordinary afternoon. My mother had gone to buy bread. A driver had rushed through a red light. Metal bending. Glass shattering. Sirens that arrived too late to prevent what mattered. The hospital corridor had smelled sterile and sharp, like disinfectant and something metallic beneath it. I remember staring at the floor tiles while the doctor spoke. She will not walk again. He said it gently. Professionally. As if the words themselves were soft enough to cushion the blow. But nothing about them was soft. My father had already been gone for years. A quiet heart attack in his sleep. One moment present, the next gone. I had found him in the morning, his face peaceful in a way that did not match the violence of losing him. After my mother's accident, it became just the two of us. No siblings. No backup plan. The apartment changed. The wheelchair became the center of every room. Doorways that once felt wide suddenly seemed narrow. Furniture had to be moved. Rugs rolled up. Corners padded. The kitchen table filled with pill organizers, prescription receipts, appointment reminders. I stopped thinking in weeks. I started thinking in dosages. In refills. In how many hours I could work without leaving her alone too long. I worked without days off. Without vacations. Without asking anyone for help. I arrived at the cafe early. I left late. I wiped tables twice, sometimes 3 times, just to avoid giving Mark a reason to complain. At first, he had seemed almost kind. "You're like family here, Emily," he used to say. And I believed him. Because I needed to believe someone was on my side. The paychecks began arriving late 3 months after the accident. "There's a small issue with the bank," he would say casually. Then came the raised voice. "You're too slow. Customers don't care about your personal life. If you're distracted, maybe this isn't the job for you." I absorbed the humiliation quietly. Every time. Because I needed the money. Because I needed stability. Because I had no luxury to argue. The only person who looked at me with steady awareness was Jack. He had started sitting near the side wall of the cafe long before my mother's accident, but I only truly noticed him afterward. He never begged. Never pressured. If I handed him a leftover sandwich at closing, he accepted it with a small nod. "You work too much," he once said. I laughed then. As if overwork had been a choice. Now, standing on that corner with the image of the thin wire burned into my mind, memories began to rearrange themselves. The blue plastic storage boxes in the basement that Mark insisted were just supplies. The nights when unfamiliar men entered through the back door after closing. The sharp tone in Mark's voice last week when I arrived earlier than usual. "Wait outside until I tell you," he had snapped. At the time, I had felt embarrassed. Now, my stomach turned cold. Had the device been there all morning? Or had someone placed it during my break? Was it meant to destroy evidence? Or to silence the first person who walked in? The first employee. The one who always unlocked the door first. Me. The thought pressed down on me so heavily I had to lean harder against the wall. If I had stepped inside. If I had pulled that door open the way I always did. What would have happened to my mother? Who would have arranged her pills in a straight line? Who would have lifted her into bed? Who would have explained why I never came home? The image was unbearable. I wrapped my arms around myself instinctively, as if trying to hold my body together. I was alive. But only because, for once, I had paused. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my aunt. "Emily," she cried, her voice already breaking, "the police were asking about you." My heart lurched. Why? They received an anonymous report about suspicious materials at the cafe. Anonymous. My eyes drifted back toward the building. Jack stood across the street now, his posture straighter than usual, his gaze fixed on the entrance. Had he called? Had someone else noticed? Or had this been unraveling long before I understood it? The sirens came moments later. Sharp. Urgent. Growing louder. People stepped out of nearby stores. Someone pointed toward the cafe. A woman covered her mouth. The quiet tension that had been building inside me finally broke open into something undeniable. This was not imagination. This was not fear exaggerating reality. This was real. And I had almost walked straight into it. Mark hadn't always been the kind of man you feared. When I first started at the cafe, he stood behind the counter with his sleeves rolled up, smiling as if he'd built the place with his bare hands. He told me he liked hiring steady people, the kind who didn't bring drama into work and didn't disappear without notice. The first week, he even slipped an extra $5 bill into my tip jar and said, "For lunch. You're doing great." After my mother's accident, when I came in with swollen eyes and the exhausted look I couldn't hide no matter how much cold water I splashed on my face, Mark lowered his voice. "Family comes first," he said. "If you need flexibility, talk to me." I remember how grateful I felt in that moment, how quickly I let myself believe I had found a rare thing, a boss who saw me as a person. He liked using the word family. It sounded warm. It sounded safe. "You're like family here, Emily," he would say, clapping my shoulder a little too firmly. "We take care of our own." I clung to that sentence the way you cling to a railing in a dark stairwell, because you need something solid under your hand, even if it isn't truly there. The change didn't happen all at once. It never does. It started with small humiliations dressed up as jokes. He'd correct me loudly in front of customers. "No, no, watch her hands. She's still learning," he'd say with a laugh, as if I were a child who needed supervision. If a customer complained, "Too hot, too cold, too slow," Mark's eyes would find me immediately, and he would perform disappointment as if it were part of the service. "You see what I deal with," he'd tell them, shaking his head. "I'm trying to run a business here." I swallowed it because I needed my job. Then the paychecks began arriving late. At first it was a day. Then 2. Then a week. Mark always had a reason ready, and he delivered it with the calm irritation of someone forced to explain something obvious to an idiot. "Bank issue," he'd say. "Transfer delay. You know how it is." When I asked politely, carefully, he leaned in as if my question was an insult. "Do I look like I'm stealing from you, Emily?" His tone made my cheeks burn. It made me feel greedy for even asking. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself businesses had problems. I told myself I could hold out, because my mother's medication didn't care about pride, and the landlord didn't accept excuses. After that came the shouting. Not every day, not at first. Just enough to train me. "You're too slow. Stop staring into space. Do you think this is a charity? If you can't handle pressure, there are plenty of girls who will." Once, when I fumbled a lid and spilled coffee down the side of a cup, he slammed his hand on the counter so hard the sugar packets jumped. "What is wrong with you?" he hissed, low enough that the customers wouldn't hear. "Are you trying to make me look bad?" I stood there with burning fingers and said, "No." And he said, "Then prove it." I began coming in earlier, leaving later, wiping the same surface twice because I was terrified of giving him a reason to explode. I learned to keep my voice soft and my face neutral. I learned to apologize even when I hadn't done anything. I learned to make myself smaller. At home, my mother watched me with quiet worry. "You're losing weight," she said one night while I helped her with her blanket. "That man is squeezing you dry." "It's just work," I lied. She reached for my hand, her fingers thin but warm. "I don't like him," she whispered. "He smiles like he's measuring people." I should have listened. A neighbor in our building, Mrs. Donnelly, warned me too. "You work at that cafe on Maple?" she asked in the elevator one evening. "I see strange cars there late at night. Men going in through the back like it's not their first time." I forced a laugh because it was easier than fear. "It's probably deliveries," I said. But the truth was, I'd seen them too. Not every night, just enough. A dark sedan parked with the engine running. A man in a clean jacket, not homeless, not a customer, slipping into the alley behind the cafe. Mark stepping outside, glancing up and down the street, and then unlocking the back door like he'd been waiting. Once, I arrived early and found the basement door locked. It was never locked. Mark appeared behind me so suddenly I jumped. "What are you doing here?" he snapped. I thought I'd start prep early," I said. His eyes narrowed. "Wait upstairs," he ordered. "Don't go down there." I remember the cold in his voice. Not anger, something sharper. Something protective. Of what? Later that week, Lena mentioned something strange without realizing it mattered. "Mark's been having meetings," she said, rolling her eyes. "Like, real secret ones. He told me to leave early and not tell anyone." "Meetings with who?" She shrugged. "Men. Suits. Not coffee people." I should have put the pieces together then. But when you're drowning, you don't solve mysteries. You focus on air. And I was drowning in bills, in fatigue, in the quiet terror of opening my mother's pill organizer and seeing empty slots where tomorrow's doses should have been. So I kept going. I kept showing up. I kept believing that if I worked hard enough, if I stayed quiet enough, if I didn't make trouble, life would stay manageable. Until that day at the door, until the lifted threshold and the thin wire forced me to finally admit what my mother had sensed all along. Mark didn't treat people like family. He treated them like tools. I stayed on that corner longer than made sense. People were beginning to gather in small knots, drawn by the growing howl of sirens the way moths lean toward porch lights. A woman in a green scarf pointed toward the cafe with a stiff arm. Someone else lifted a phone and began filming, not because they understood anything, but because they wanted proof that they had been nearby when something happened. I kept my eyes on the entrance. From where I stood, the door still looked harmless, just glass and brass, smudged by 100 hands. The lifted strip of metal was too small to see from this distance. The thin wire had vanished into the geometry of the frame, and if I hadn't been inches away from it moments earlier, I might have doubted myself too. My phone buzzed again. I flinched, as though the vibration itself could set off whatever was waiting beneath that threshold. It was my mother. I answered on the first ring. "Emily," she whispered, and there was a tremor in her voice that made my stomach tighten. "Where are you? Why aren't you inside?" I called again and again and it went to voicemail. "I'm outside," I said. "I'm fine." There was a pause. I could hear her breathing, that careful, practiced breathing of someone who had learned to ration air. Then she said, very quietly, "Promise me you're not near the door." I stared at the cafe windows. "I'm not," I lied, because I didn't want her fear to become a physical thing in our apartment. I stepped away. My aunt's earlier words returned to me. "The police were asking about you." I imagined officers walking into the cafe, speaking with Mark, asking for employee names. I imagined Mark's face when someone mentioned mine. The thought turned my mouth dry. "I have to go home," I told my mother. "Right now?" "No," she said sharply, surprising me with the sudden strength in her tone. "Don't. Stay where there are people. Don't be alone." I swallowed. "Okay. Did Jack say anything else?" she asked. The fact that she said his name, said it as if she had already accepted his role in this, sent a strange, grateful ache through me. "He told me to step away," I said. And I listened. She exhaled slowly. "Good." Across the street, Jack stood with his hands tucked into his coat pockets, shoulders squared as if bracing for impact. He wasn't watching the crowd. He was watching the door. His face was still, but something in the set of his jaw told me he was measuring time. I ended the call with my mother only because I couldn't keep hearing her voice tremble like that. I needed my hands free to think. The sirens grew louder. A police car skidded into place near the curb, lights flashing blue and red across the cafe windows. Another followed, then an unmarked vehicle. Officers moved quickly, not running, but with the decisive speed of people who already believed the threat was real. Yellow tape appeared as if conjured from thin air. Someone told the crowd to step back. A few people protested. Most obeyed. I stepped behind the tape and kept my head down, suddenly afraid that if I looked too guilty, someone would ask my name. I didn't know why I was afraid of being known, maybe because I sensed that the danger wasn't only the device under the door. Maybe it was also the fact that I had seen it. I lifted my phone and scrolled with shaking fingers until I found my mother's contact again. Under her name was a message thread filled with ordinary things. "Did you eat? Bring milk. Don't forget your scarf." It looked like a normal life. That normality felt obscene. My thumb hovered over my aunt's number. I called. She answered with a sob already in her throat. "Emily, thank God." "Where are you?" "Outside," I said. "Tell me what you know." "They said there was a report," she whispered. "Something about wiring and boxes and suspicious activity." They asked if you were working today and I told them you always open the cafe. I thought they needed to find you to warn you. My knees weakened. I leaned against the brick wall again, the same cold surface as before, because it was the only thing that felt solid. I saw it, I said, barely hearing my own voice. There's a wire under the threshold. Jack stopped me. A sharp inhale. Then silence, the kind that comes when someone's imagination finally catches up. Oh my God, she said. Oh my God. In the distance, Mark's voice rose above the street noise. I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the pitch, offended, loud, theatrical. He was performing innocence the way he performed authority. I ended the call and stared at the scene unfolding. 2 officers approached the door cautiously. One of them crouched, peering at the lower frame. Another spoke into a radio. Within minutes, a van arrived, bomb squad. Men in heavy protective gear stepped out, moving with careful, practiced precision. The crowd shifted backward as if the air itself had grown dangerous. My mind began stitching together the memory fragments I had kept refusing to connect. The blue boxes in the basement. The nights when Mark insisted everyone leave early. The strangers who used the back alley like it was an entrance they owned. The time Mark snapped at me for arriving before he was ready. Wait outside until I tell you. I had thought it was cruelty. Now it felt like control over who saw what, and when. My stomach turned cold. What had Mark been hiding? And why did the hiding now require something that could kill the first person who opened the door? The tape fluttered slightly in the wind. A camera lens glinted from someone's phone. Somewhere behind me, a child asked what was happening, and an adult hissed for them to be quiet. I looked at Jack again. He finally turned his head and met my eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply held my gaze for a long beat, and in that silent exchange I felt the weight of what he had given me, not comfort, not reassurance, time. Time to step away. Time to live. And as the bomb squad knelt at the threshold and began their careful work, I realized something else with sudden, sinking clarity. This wasn't over just because I had walked away from the door. If someone had set that trap, they had expected me to be the one to trigger it. Which meant, somewhere in all this, my name had mattered. The street had turned into a corridor of flashing light. Red and blue reflections crawled over the cafe windows, over the parked cars, over the faces of people who had come closer than they should. Someone's phone chimed with a new message, and another person laughed nervously, as if laughter could prove this wasn't real. The yellow tape bowed in the wind like a thin, fragile border between ordinary life and something violent. The bomb squad worked in a kind of silence that felt loud. 2 men in heavy suits knelt at the threshold. One of them held a small mirror on a stick, angling it beneath the lifted metal strip. Another spoke into a radio in short, precise phrases. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the rhythm: procedure, caution, time. Mark kept shouting. He paced behind the tape as if he owned the sidewalk. His face was flushed, his mouth moving too fast, his hands cutting the air in sharp gestures. "This is harassment," he yelled. "You're scaring customers. You're ruining my business." An officer told him to step back. Mark didn't step back. "I know my rights," he snapped, and then he looked past the officer, past the tape, straight toward the crowd, as if searching for someone to blame. For a split second, his eyes landed on me. It was brief, but it was enough. His gaze didn't hold surprise. It held calculation. Like a man checking whether a tool had been removed from the box before the job was done. My stomach turned over. I lowered my chin instinctively, as though making myself smaller could make me invisible. But it was too late. I already felt the truth of what my body had known all day: this wasn't random, and I wasn't just a bystander. A camera crew arrived, because cameras always arrive. They moved with practiced hunger, aiming lenses at the cafe door, at the bomb squad, at Mark's flailing outrage. A reporter adjusted her hair and began speaking into a microphone with the calm excitement of someone who had found a story worth selling. Authorities have responded to a potential explosive device. Potential. As if the thin wire beneath the threshold were merely an idea. I heard murmurs ripple through the crowd. Explosive? Was someone hurt? Why here? Isn't this just a coffee shop? A woman near me pressed her hand to her mouth. A man pulled his child closer. Someone else whispered, I was going to go in there. I wanted to tell them, I was going to open that door. I was going to be the first. I felt my throat tighten, not from tears, but from the pressure of holding something too large inside my body. Across the street, Jack stood in the same spot, still as a post. He didn't look impressed by the cameras or shaken by the lights. His gaze never left the entrance. He looked like someone waiting for the end of a long sentence. Then one of the bomb squad technicians raised his hand. Everything around him seemed to pause. The technician's movements became smaller, slower. He slid a thin tool beneath the lifted strip. Another man held the door frame steady, as if even breathing too hard might change the outcome. I heard a faint metallic click. A woman behind me gasped. My heart beat once, hard, like a fist against bone. The technician eased something out. At first it looked like nothing, a dark shape, compact, wrapped tight, wires branching from it like veins. Then he turned it slightly and the sunlight caught the casing. The shape became unmistakable. A device. Not a loose wire. Not a prank. Not potential. A real bomb. My knees weakened so fast I had to grab the tape to steady myself. The plastic vibrated under my hand. I realized I was shaking as if my body had finally caught up to what my mind had been refusing. The crowd made a sound, one collective inhale, sharp and frightened. Mark's shouting broke into something uglier. That's not mine, he screamed, voice cracking. You're wrong. You're planting that. This is insane. The officer nearest him moved in closer. Another officer stepped behind Mark, quiet and ready. Mark pointed wildly toward the cafe, toward the bomb squad, toward the crowd, as if accusation could rearrange reality. This is my cafe. I built this place. I don't know anything about that. But then something changed. A different officer approached, holding a tablet. He spoke to the lead investigator, who glanced at the screen, then turned toward Mark with a look that was no longer neutral. It was the look of someone who has moved past suspicion and into certainty. Mark's face faltered. Just for a moment. His eyes flicked to the tablet. Then to the crowd. Then, again, toward me, quick, sharp, almost pleading, as if he was trying to calculate whether I had said something, whether I had been seen, whether the plan had failed because of my mouth or because of Jack's grip on my wrist. The investigator spoke, loud enough that the microphones caught it. We have footage from the rear alley, he said. And phone records placing you here after hours. Mark froze. The words didn't land like drama. They landed like a door closing. A second officer added something quietly, too quiet for me to hear, but the investigator nodded, and then he raised his hand. Mark Hensley, he said, you're under arrest. For a beat, the street was silent. Even the reporter stopped talking. Then Mark exploded. This is a mistake, he shouted, jerking his arms as officers grabbed him. Emily, he yelled suddenly, and my blood went cold at the sound of my name on his tongue. He didn't finish. The officer shoved him forward, twisting his wrists behind his back. Metal cuffs snapped closed. Mark's face contorted as if he'd been insulted by physics itself. The cameras zoomed in. The reporter's voice returned, hungry again. And I stood behind the tape, tasting metal in my mouth, watching the man who had called me family hauled away like a stranger. I looked for Jack. He finally turned his head slightly and met my eyes. He gave me the smallest nod. Not triumph. Not pity. Just confirmation. It was real. And it had almost been me. When the last police car pulled away with Mark inside it, the street didn't feel victorious. It felt emptied out, like a room after a fight, when the furniture is still upright but something in the air has been bruised. The bomb squad carried the device into their van with the kind of care you give a sleeping infant. Cameras followed every step. The reporter kept talking, her voice bright and steady, as if she were describing weather instead of death. People lingered behind the tape, hungry for closure they would never truly get. Then, slowly, the crowd began to thin. Curiosity has a short attention span. I stayed. I couldn't make my feet move. My knees felt unreliable, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The cold had found a way under my coat and into my bones, but it wasn't winter doing that. It was the sudden understanding that I had almost been erased from the world in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. An officer approached me and asked my name. I told him. My voice came out thin, polite, as if I were ordering a drink. He asked if I was hurt. I said no. It felt dishonest. I wasn't bleeding, but something inside me had been torn open. I watched them roll the yellow tape back into itself, neat and efficient, as if danger could be folded up and stored away. The cafe door stood there again, quiet and innocent, the wire now gone, the metal strip pressed flat, restored to normal. That bothered me more than anything. How quickly the world tries to look unchanged. I sat down on the curb because my body finally demanded something simple, a place to collapse. The sidewalk was cold through my jeans. I pressed my palms against it and felt grit under my fingertips. Small, ordinary dirt. Proof that life was still made of small things. Only then did I cry. Not loudly. Not in a way that drew attention. My tears came steady, almost calm, sliding down my cheeks as if they'd been waiting for permission all day. I thought of my mother's apartment. The porridge bowl. The pills lined up like tiny promises. Her voice on the phone, trying to sound strong for me. If I had died, she would have been alone in that room with no explanation, no help, no next step. The image hit so hard I had to clamp my hand over my mouth. I felt guilty, sharp, humiliating guilt, for all the times I dismissed her worry as weakness. For every, "I'm fine," I said when I wasn't. For every time I chose work over listening because bills felt more urgent than instincts. A shadow fell across me. Jack sat down beside me without asking. He didn't touch me. He didn't tell me to breathe. He just sat, shoulder to shoulder, like someone who understood that after fear, silence is sometimes the only mercy. "You did good," he said quietly. I shook my head. I didn't do anything. I walked away. "That's doing something," he replied. My phone rang again. My mother. I wiped my face with my sleeve and answered. Her voice broke the moment she heard mine. "Emily?" "I'm here," I whispered. "I'm alive." She began to cry too, and hearing her cry made my own tears worsen, because her sobs carried the weight of what could have happened. She kept saying my name as if repeating it could anchor me to the world. "I'm coming home," I told her, though my legs still felt weak. "Not yet," she said. "Stay where you are until it's safe." Safe. The words sounded like a luxury. When I finally stood, my body swayed slightly. The street looked brighter than it should have. Too clear. Too sharp. I walked slowly, one careful step at a time, as if the ground might betray me. Before I left, I looked back at the cafe. The windows reflected sunlight. The sign still hung above the door. Everything looked normal, and that was the cruelest part. Because I knew how close normal had come to becoming my ending. A week after the arrest, the cafe stayed dark, the chairs flipped onto tables like tired legs. The sign still hung there, but nobody went in. The windows held no warmth anymore. Mark was in custody. The police said, pending charges, but their eyes said certain. I gave my statement twice, then once more on camera, hands folded to hide shaking. They told me the device was meant to detonate when the door opened and weight shifted. Hearing that explained the nausea that still rose whenever I touched any handle at all. I went back to my mother, and for days I moved like someone learning the house again. I checked locks, checked windows, checked the hallway, then hated myself for checking. But fear is stubborn, it wants proof every morning that yesterday didn't come back. The city offered compensation for employees and victims. I didn't believe it at first. When the letter arrived, I read it 3 times, then sat down as if my bones were older. The amount wasn't a miracle, but it was enough to breathe without counting breaths. I paid the pharmacy bill in one transaction, no begging, no splitting doses to stretch. My mother watched me tuck the receipt away and whispered, "Thank God," like prayer. I thought of all the times I'd swallowed pride to keep Mark from docking my hours. Now his cruelty had a courtroom number, and my quiet endurance had a paper trail. Jack met me outside the precinct one afternoon, hat in hand, eyes steady as always. He said the officers treated him with respect once they learned he'd served overseas. It struck me how quickly people change their tone when they're told a person matters. I asked him where he would go now that the cafe was gone, his corner erased. He shrugged, but I saw the truth. He had nowhere that felt like a place to return to. So I did something I'd never done before. I made a decision without apologizing. I invited him to coffee in a small diner, and we sat by the window in plain daylight. We talked about rent, about permits, about the kind of place we wished existed. Not a glamorous cafe, just a clean room, honest prices, and no backdoor shadows. My mother said, "Call it something hopeful," when I told her the idea at home. She held my hand and added, "If you build it with doors you can trust." The months that followed were paperwork and dust and the smell of fresh paint. I learned about licenses and inspections, about suppliers who demanded cash up front. Jack helped without pride, sanding counters, fixing chairs, humming to himself softly. When we hung the sign, my hands didn't shake, my body finally understood safety. We named it Second Chance, because that's what he gave me and what I took. On opening morning, the espresso machine sighed like a calm animal waking up. My mother sat near the window in her scarf, sunlight warming the backs of her hands. Jack stood at the counter, nervous and dignified, as if wearing responsibility again. Customers came slowly at first, nurses, bus drivers, students with tired eyes. Some asked about the name. I smiled and said, "Everyone needs one, sometimes." I hired 2 women who needed steady hours, and I paid them on time, always. At night I locked up and walked home with my shoulders down, not clenched. Mark's sentence came later, and I didn't celebrate. I simply felt the air get lighter. The cafe that almost killed me became the reason I stopped living like a target. I didn't win a fantasy life. I won something rarer, a life that belongs to me. And every morning when I set out my mother's pills, I do it with quiet gratitude. This story did not make me braver overnight. It made me more attentive. I learned that kindness is not weakness, but it must have boundaries. I learned that listening to the quiet voice, the one that whispers before danger shouts, can save your life. And I learned that sometimes the person the world ignores is the one who sees most clearly. If I had dismissed my mother's fear, if I had shaken off Jack's warning, if I had told myself I was being dramatic, I would not be here. Now tell me honestly. Would you have walked away from that door?